I'm registered dietitian Abby Sharp, and on my new podcast, Bite Back with Abby Sharp, I'll be dismantling the multi-billion-dollar diet industry that keeps us in a cycle of self-loathing and food fear. Join me every Tuesday for expert interviews, engaging conversations, and my signature science and sass to bust myths, correct misinformation, and help you break free from diet culture for good. Listen for free on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the original podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, TIFF's Senior International Programmer for Canada, and this is The Other Thing I Do. My guest this week is Zach Clark, a veteran indie editor whose feature films as a writer and director include Vacation, Little Sister, and White Reindeer. His latest, The Becomers, is a really interesting take on the body snatcher subgenre of sci-fi horror, and that is all I will allow myself to say about it. It's just had a theatrical run in the States, and it's available today on Blu-ray in a new special edition from Dark Star Pictures, and you should check it out. Zach picked Spider Baby, or The Maddest Story Ever Told, Jack Hill's unquantifiable 1967 study of three siblings afflicted with a genetic disorder that causes them to revert to an adolescent or infantile state. They live with their aging caretaker, played by Lon Chaney Jr., in a house in the middle of nowhere, a place where they can bother nobody and nobody can bother them. Until a distant cousin brings his sister, his lawyer, and his lawyer's secretary out to see the property, and everything goes to hell. Beloved by some, feared by others, Spider Baby is one of those chaotic grindhouse indies that you kind of need to see to believe, but it does make for a really good conversation. This is Someone Else's Movie.
Well, first and foremost, I only watch horror movies in October. So I had to pick a horror movie so to not break with my October viewing. And this is a movie that has been very near and dear to my heart for a really long time. It's a movie I saw in my late teens, probably for the first time, and then for a while in my life, I was with my partner and my college girlfriend and I would watch movies again and again and again. You know, we'd be like, "Oh, what's for dinner? Let's throw this movie on." So it was a movie that for maybe 5 or 6 years of my life, I watched maybe once a month. And I don't know, it's a very I haven't sat down and watched it all the way through in a while. It's a very cozy movie for me. It sort of reminds me of a specific time in my life, but it still has stuff in it, and kind of always one of those movies where every single time you watch it, for me, it kind of always feels like I'm watching it for the first time.
It's interesting that you would, that you frame it as comfort food, because it's so assaultive in a way.
Sure.
But it is a family story, and obviously the thing I do when somebody tells me what the film is that they want to talk about is immediately try to stitch it together into their own work. And it's like, well, The Becomers is also kind of about people learning how to behave.
Sure. It has this sort of perversion of the normal. That I've always found myself pretty attracted to. I was rereading there's that Research Incredibly Strange Films book, which is a seminal text of cult cinema, and I was rereading the Spider Baby entry on it, and it's where the phrase "like a television sitcom directed by Louis Buñuel" comes from, and that's pretty accurate. And then the other thing it also says, which I wrote down, is all the characters are odd, yet unaware that others consider them odd, which is also, I think, a sort of fair assessment of the movie's strangeness. I mean, to me, when I say comforting, I think, I would put Female Trouble and Faster Pussycat in this category as well, which are just movies that I know so well that watching them is sort of spending time with an old friend. Does that make sense? It's not necessarily Female Trouble isn't necessarily a quote unquote comforting movie, nor is Faster Pussycat Kill Kill. But to me, they're so important to me. And I've seen them so many times that you find like a scene starts and you're like, oh, this is the scene where da 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 happens. Oh, this is the, oh, it's that. Oh, it's like, oh, it's these characters again. And they just put you in a really special mood.
Yeah, I can see that. There's something else too. All of those films are, technically speaking, outlaw movies, films made by people outside the system, but also about society breaking down and small enclaves maintaining something of themselves.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, they're about stability in a really perverse way, which Spider Baby, absolutely. I mean, it's about a place where no one is sane. Even the caretaker is functioning from a broken perspective, and even the normies are weirdos. The that opening sequence where we learn what Mary syndrome is read to us enthusiastically by the square of the film, right? The normal person who is going to be the hero, and he is just so clearly pitched at a level of this weird enthusiasm.
Sure. Yeah, it's a real bygone trope that I wish was brought back in some way. But like a movie being opened by like a person sitting in a chair talking about the movie you're about to see.
Yeah. I didn't see you there.
I was like, this is good. Someone should do this again.
It's really like, it speaks to a place and time where, who was it? I think it was Stephen King who wrote about it in Danse Macabre, that when he went to see Fantastic Voyage, it opens with a crawl about the human body or some text screens or something. And he was too young to read it quickly enough. So his father read it to him and he internalized it. And it's like, oh, well, this is a documentary. If that's what this is about, this must be true.
Sure.
And it's a way of establishing the movie's reality, even if it's a completely preposterous story. It's Criswell, right? It's Plan 9. That's the thing I always think about.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but it's also, it's like it's Rod Serling and Alfred Hitchcock too. It's that like it's that like sense of you're going to be told a story. And I think that's also something that is sort of cozy and comforting about it, is that Spider Baby has the sort of like vibe of you're being told a story. Also in a way that like it feels very like EC Comics too, like the Crypt Keeper and that sort of framing of something. Which
like a host.
Yes, which this is obviously like, I was sort of thinking about the progenitors of this and what was sort of happening in the culture at large that might have sort of fed into this. And EC Comics certainly have to have been part of it. It's of that same texture.
Yeah, the hysteria would have been 10 years before, right? And this is 67, so it is so odd that this film is existing in the same time and space as Night of the Living Dead, right? Like something like that, where they look the same, they're both set in isolated residences, and one of them is this unrelenting documentary style, like flat friggin' horror film that resonates through every generation and keeps getting rediscovered by people who've never heard of it and realized that, oh, no, I have to take this seriously. It's not culty. And then there's this thing, which is an unquantifiable object. Just the dissonance created by that opening, those credits with the poem and Lon Chaney reading this absolutely
it's great.
Dr. Seussian thing about cannibal orgies, but with this playful, enthusiastic tone. And then it goes into this straight up depiction of mania.
So I was doing some of this research ahead of time. It might be worth, I introduced this movie at a Metrograph screening in 2017, and I have the thing I wrote before it, which is maybe worth reading at one point.
Please.
But so it's interesting because it was released in 1967. It was shot in August and September of 1964. And this is interesting, because when I was watching it this time through, I was like, it sort of takes the premise of the Addams Family a few steps beyond, But the Addams Family TV show came out, the first episode of the Addams Family TV show and the Munsters are September of 1964. So production on this was wrapped when those came out. So it's it's not borrowing. It's not borrowing from that. It's like something is in the ether. Something is in the ether in 1964 that is like telling people that like these sort of macabre, like jokey macabre stuff
Yeah, the
is
American Family
is
Unit plus
yes, yeah,
this.
yes, is like a ripe space for making stuff.
Yeah, well, 64, I mean, the Twilight Zone is still on the air. I think The
Hmm.
Outer Limits is
Hmm.
coming. It might not have
Sure.
started yet, but it's in there. But genre has been mainstreamed already on a certain
Yes.
level,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's a very proper type of genre.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, the Munsters was a response to the Universal Monsters. What, 30 years later, or
Sure.
10 years after the final petering out of all the Frankenstein meets the Wolfman movies, or maybe that was even the late 40s. Abbott and Costello had already been mocking them.
Sure. Sure. Sure.
It's so weird to be looking back at something that far in our past and realizing that the pieces of that past were closer together than we can imagine. You know, like the 30s
Sure.
and the 60s,
Yeah.
there's not a lot of room separating those two
Yeah.
things.
For sure. For sure. For sure.
But the yeah, and the Adams Family is based on the cartoons, right? So those were
Hmm.
Charles Adams sketches,
Yep.
cartoons. I mean, hand-drawn pieces of art that are now also kind of circulating around. Like that's really more of a New Yorker thing. I don't like
Sure.
I
Sure.
never really got a sense of just how popularized the Adams cartoons were before the Adams Family show became a thing.
I feel like, I mean, uh, without speaking without too much authority,
Hmm.
Jack Hill is a bit of an aesthete, and is probably enough of an intellectual that he would have been aware of the cartoons at this time, you know.
Yeah. I mean, you have to be pretty knowledgeable to make a movie full stop, right? There aren't a lot of idiots who get to be directors.
Oh, sure. And in contrast to, I think it was UCLA. He's from UCLA. He went to
Mm.
UCLA. In contrast to like Night of the Living Dead, Spider Baby is like a very cleanly, traditionally shot and put together movie, you know?
Yep.
It really does. It really does sort of have that sitcom panache of the time. Um, yeah, and it like has like cool, fun little tricks and winks and stuff in it. Yeah, it's like a very accomplished first feature.
Also speaking to the appeal of older culture that it's sort of not necessarily lampooning but incorporating. You've got Mantan Moreland, who was a black comic from the 30s and 40s,
Mhm.
who shows up in the opening scene and apparently is there to trick the audience into thinking it's going to be fun, and then he is violently stabbed in the face
Sure,
repeatedly.
sure. Yep.
I mean, the violence is clean by comparison. Like if you're talking about a horror film, this really doesn't fall into that category.
Sure, it's not gory,
Mm.
but it is pretty mean, I would say.
Yeah, I think it
Like,
happens so soon, so quickly in the film that we don't really fully process how violent it is. Like we're not allowed to understand how violent it is. Certain images are held back from us, and also um, Virginia is having so much fun doing it that
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is maybe a good segue for me to read this intro that I
oh
wrote
yeah,
because
please.
it touches on some of these things. So forgive me for talking for like 5 minutes
No,
in a
this
row.
is why you're here.
I'll have a sip of water first. Okay, so whatever happened to Spider Baby? Asked the theatrical poster for exploitation auteur Jack Hill's first feature film, shot in the late summer of 1964, but not released commercially until Christmas Eve 1967. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane had been released 2 years prior to Spider Baby's production and had been a hit, made for just under $1 million and grossing close to 10 theatrically. It isn't difficult to see the echoes of Baby Jane and Spider Baby, which both feature baby-talking female ghouls in their titular roles, decaying mansions, and perverse familial dynamics. The exploitation film industry was still riding a teen wave in 1964, which saw the release of not one, but two Frankie and Annette Beach Party movies. So why not adapt Robert Aldrich's macabre masterpiece for a younger generation? I Was a Teenage Baby Jane Hudson. It's that basic B-movie borrowing trick that gives Spider Baby its terrifying power and its enduring status as a cult classic. First and foremost, Spider Baby is about adolescence, and its main characters live their lives inside a sort of teen angst daydream. What jaded 15-year-old growing up in the suburbs wouldn't prescribe to the belief that the older you get, the stupider you become, and wouldn't gleefully indulge in the fantasy of escaping to a big old house where they could do what they wanted, kill anyone who annoyed them, and seduce attractive strangers, all far away from the prying eyes of boring mainstream society. Teenage monsters in haunted homes, as the theme song says. By adding the nursery rhyme speech patterns, the tattered baby doll clothes, and the dead smile of baby Jane Hudson to the living embodiment of teen angst at its most nihilistic, Spider Baby gave birth to a new kind of monster. And it would take less than 2 years after the film's release for those monsters to come to life. While the film is often cited for introducing genre character actor icon Sid Haig, and for featuring a late career, surprisingly sympathetic performance from Lon Chaney Jr., the real stars are undoubtedly Beverly Washburn and Jill Banner, as sisters Virginia and Elizabeth Mary. Washburn was an accomplished child actress with a prolific career in television, whose first screen credit was at age 7. Banner makes her big screen debut in Spider Baby, though she would appear in several other films before it saw its official release. Washburn is still working as an actress today. Banner got burnout on the industry and moved to New Mexico to be a real estate agent. She died in a car crash in 1982 after moving back to Hollywood to return to show business. They're the perfect duo together. Banner underplays everything, and Washburn constantly turns up to 11, leering like a maniac, her bug eyes pointing in all directions. With their wild tangles of hair, ratty second-hand woman-child clothing, and insatiable lust for murder, especially if it involves inflicting multiple stab wounds, Virginia and Elizabeth Mary were the Manson girls years before Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Quinn-Wrinkle were going on creepy crawls and committing multiple homicides. Charles Manson called his followers these children that come at you with knives, and I can think of no better way to describe the two sisters at the heart of this movie. Spider Baby may play as surface level creepy and kooky on first viewing, but keep looking and keep thinking about it. Be sure not to miss the baby doll crucified to a spider web hanging on the wall in the film's most classically exploitative sequence. In the Mary house, the cobwebs and rats and stuffed owls and all the other trappings of cheap B horror are just that. Smoke and mirrors that hide the film's real terror. The vengeful specters of teen angst come to life. Every suburban parent's worst nightmare.
That's great. How did it play with an audience?
Great. I mean, it's the other thing that is always striking about this, and especially in rewatching it, is that it's like first and foremost a very fun movie. And this is I think one of my favorite things in any movie is when you can tell that everybody is having a really good time making it.
Yeah.
And this is just a movie where you can just, all the performances have so much joy in them. Everybody seems to be having so much fun. Like the dialogue is all fun to say, you know. It is good dialogue. But there's good dialogue and there's dialogue that's fun to say. You know?
Yeah.
All the dialogue in this movie is very, and again, not even just, I wouldn't even call it like quotable, but it's fun to repeat.
Yeah. I mean, watching it last night on the Criterion Channel, incredibly enough, I just realized that there is something so odd and formal about what Lon Chaney is doing as Bruno, where he's behaving as though he's the most sane and respectable person by holding himself very straight and standing very still and constantly doing father figure stuff like, well, there's no such thing as evil.
Yeah.
And it's like he's trying to, I couldn't figure it out. It's like he's trying to stand his ground in a tornado, because everyone around him they're not moving like people anymore. They're doing these weird interpretive physical things. And it's all perfectly appropriate for what the characters are going through and who they're supposed to be. But just the fact that this big square man, this stocky gentleman in a limo driver's uniform, just keeps insisting that everything is normal and this is fine, as even to the end when he's, pulling out an Acme level bundle of dynamite and saying, no, this is going to make everything okay.
Yeah. Well, it is sort of father knows best, it is it is a sort of parody of that. But he is also like, in theory, if no one comes to that, as long as no one comes over, everything is normal. Everything is fine. He is the law of the house. And that has been his role. And it is sort of like, it is this sort of mad portrait of like, yep. Toe the party line, say everything's okay, everything will be okay. And he's really good in this movie.
He is. He's compelling.
Lon Chaney Jr. is really good, and he is not a good actor.
He had that sweet spot right? And I think he would have hated to hear this, I suspect, because I'm sure he always wanted to do more, but he had that sweet spot of Larry Talbot where he just
Sure.
wants to die. He wants this to be over.
Sure.
The carrying
Yeah,
this
yeah, yeah.
cloak of misery, like he just looks
Yeah.
like he's always sad.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it translates here. Like, here's an authority figure that no one will listen to.
Yeah.
An expert in nothing who keeps insisting he knows what's going on.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah, it is.
mm-hmm.
It's he's the sitcom patriarch who just can't stop his kids from killing,
Yeah.
from destroying.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like the other thing I kept thinking of, and bringing up Manson, I mean, certainly it went through my head while I was watching the film. It's like Spider Baby is what I think that the mainstream culture imagined the Manson family to be.
Oh, sure.
Realistically, they were probably just high all the time, and they probably didn't wash that often, and they were incredibly violent and ritualistic. But it's like we're watching this late phase of the Trump campaign now, where all they can do is demonize immigrants and migrants, and now he's pivoted to the genes thing. He's finally gone full eugenics.
Sure.
And all of those arguments demand the audience to stop seeing anyone other than them as human, right? Like, to completely depersonalize and dehumanize the other, or other people, rather, to other people. And Spider Baby kind of wants to do that from the reverse.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Inside with people, but they're still human. Like, they're still allowed to have desires and hopes and love and needs. I mean, they're all perverse, but there's like support for them.
Yeah, I think it is that perspective shift that makes this movie so endearing for me, and makes the Munsters and the Addams Family so endearing, because the work itself presents their thing as normal. This is obviously very pertinent to the Alien movie that I made, or it takes them at face value and presents other people as strange, and presents normal life as something to be unpacked and questioned.
Yeah.
There's also something, I don't know, I've always said that there's like, in regards to Manson, in regards to this movie, there is a sort of like, there's a evil in California that you don't get in other parts of the country.
Yeah.
And while this movie isn't necessarily set in Hollywood proper, it does feel like, it's there is this sort of like, you're out in the sun too long kind of feel to it. It's also very, it's a very bright movie. A lot of things in this movie happen in broad daylight.
Yeah, much more than I'd remembered.
But yeah. It's that simple reverse always works for me. That just inverting whose side you're on, and making who would traditionally be the villains, I won't say right, but in most movies, the protagonists, and asking for your sympathy really sort of always does it for me.
Yeah. And again, this prefigures Texas Chainsaw by what, 7 years, even 10,
for sure,
really,
for sure,
by when it was shot.
For sure.
And it's the same basic thing. Don't go in the house and you'll be fine. Don't bother them. Leave them alone.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just that this is a lot more animated. There's
less jokes in Texas Chainsaw.
Yeah. Although, Lee Hooper always insisted it was a comedy. It's like, no, it's really not. You made the most disturbing thing.
Yeah, less charming. Though I do think things like that sort of crucified baby doll speak to Texas Chainsaw. Like, the design of that house in Texas Chainsaw is, for its time, very classic haunted house. And it's obviously sort of become classic because it's 50 years old or whatever.
It continues to echo. But I mean, you've got the Bates Motel and the house behind that 10 years earlier.
Absolutely,
all those other things. But it's such a simple, and most of this, I'm sure, just comes from budgetary restrictions, right? Like, you need a standing house. You can't build a nightmare home.
Sure, of course.
You need a single location because it's a low budget film, and that's simplest. You need 2 cars at most, right?
Sure,
like, it's all about but the budgets of the time and the nature of shoots function to isolate all of these stories in a way that's really unsettling
Sure,
in a way
sure.
that no one intends, right? Because we in the theater are trapped with them as well. There's nowhere to go,
Hmm.
right? Like there's no other house you can run to.
Well, and that's like it's a very like deep, real, primal fear to
Mm-hmm.
be just outside of society, somewhere where you can't readily find your way back or you're stuck somewhere. And yeah, also from a monetary perspective, if you can't build a creepy house from the ground up, how do you make an existing house creepy? You put a bunch of spider webs up.
Yeah.
You cover it with cobwebs and maybe throw a crucified baby doll in the background of one scene. It is that, and you see it in the Addams Family as well, although that's obviously a set, but it's this sort of like
Yeah.
yeah,
Perverted decor.
stuff taken from the Universal films of the 30s. And then where are we in the like also this also just occurred to me is has like Corman's Poe cycle started at this
Yeah, that was the
point?
early 60s.
So it's certainly that stuff has to be part of it as well. And like I guess The Raven is also maybe a progenitor of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Or the Terror or anything where there's just a
Yeah.
Gothic castle and some people in robes.
Yeah, and I think Jack Hill is one of the however many dozens of directors on The Terror.
I think he did work on it. That's right. I think maybe am I remembering correctly? Did Tarantino talk about that at some point? He must have. That would have been his thing.
I was going through the Jack Hill filmography on the old Letterboxd earlier today, and it did list him. There's actually a bunch of stuff where he appears to just have shot some scenes for.
Right. He definitely. Oh yeah, he's uncredited director and co-writer here on the uh, on the Wikipedia page as well. He's also. This is the thing that fascinates me. He created a 20-minute introduction to the Wasp Woman
Uh-huh.
TV syndication in 1962 for Corman,
That's
which
wild.
I have never seen, but now I really want to. How do you make a
Sure, sure,
20-minute
sure.
introduction to the Wasp
Yeah, I
Woman?
don't know. It's just to pad it out for TV running time, I guess, is
I
the
guess, or a whole new prologue, maybe.
I was just a person in a chair for 20 minutes talking about the movie you're about to
Yeah,
watch.
you could get away with it. We we are in a place now where it is possible to pull anything up from the vaults if you're lucky enough. If you can find the source
Sure,
materials, we have the tech to restore it. There are new 4K
sure,
restorations of very unlikely movies happening every year.
sure. Yeah.
But I think some things should be left alone, and maybe the Wasp Woman prologue is one of them. I'm glad
Maybe,
Spider
maybe.
Baby found favor with Criterion because yeah, he's someone who I'm assuming would have been completely forgotten if it hadn't been for Tarantino loving Switchblade Sisters,
Yeah.
what, 25
Yeah.
years ago?
Yeah. Yeah. I saw this movie on VHS for the first
Mm-hmm.
time, bought the DVD whenever it came out. And then now I just, before this call, watched Arrow did the
The disc,
like
yeah.
just a beautiful Blu-ray of it. But yeah, the other thing too is I read the research book and then I was flipping through just to see I have those old Psychotronic video guides.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and there's a very brief entry on it in the first one, and it's not mentioned at all in the second one. Just sort of weird that it's sort of passed over even by that text. But it reminded me of again this time where it was like, and even just rereading the research thing, half of that write up on it is just a description of the plot. Because when those books came out, there was no you didn't know if they didn't have it at your video store. Um, that's kind of all you had. You'd be like, "Oh, I read about this movie,"
Yeah, no, I was the
and
same.
then
I had the
and
Golden Turkey Awards books and things to just
yeah,
guide me to the culture that I could not access
yeah,
at all.
yeah, and those movies would just like live in your head for years. Um,
And
and
get
now
more
you can
interesting, I
see,
assume, right? If you're inventing things,
sure,
if you're coming
sure,
up with the
sure,
images.
sure, sure. Well, now you can see, yeah, now you can see pretty much all of them. They're all, most things are accessible.
Yeah.
Which, I think from a point of view of watching things, I do miss the hunt a little bit, and I do miss that feeling of like, oh, I'm like in this city that I'm not normally in. Let me go to their alternative video store and see if they might have some things I've been trying to find and haven't. I remember going to Midnight Madness in Portland for the first time in like 2004 and just being like, oh my gosh, there's like 10 things I've always wanted to see that are here. But at the same time, I did want to see those movies. So on the flip side of it, like having things be more accessible is actually nice
Oh, yeah. It's
because
funny, like,
the distance between hearing about something and seeing it is very low. If anything, I have the opposite problem, which is that there are now too many things I've heard of and want to see, and it's hard to know how to parse what to watch.
Hey, it's Norm interrupting my own show to bring you up to speed on Shiny Things, my newsletter about physical media, culture, and the odd streaming project. Last week, I wrote about the new 4K release of Lee Isaac Chung's Twisters, and Arrow Video's gargantuan special edition of the first 4 Hellraiser movies, The Quartet of Torment. Sign up for a 14-day free trial at shiny-things.ghost.io, or find a link at the Simcast Blue Sky account. You like reading about movies? I like writing about them. Come check it out.
I'm registered dietitian Abby Sharp, and on my new podcast, Bite Back with Abby Sharp, I'll be dismantling the multi-billion-dollar diet industry that keeps us in a cycle of self-loathing and food fear. Join me every Tuesday for expert interviews, engaging conversations, and my signature science and sass to bust myths, correct misinformation, and help you break free from diet culture for good. Listen for free on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts.
It's the tile problem, right? On every streaming service, you'll just look at a bunch of things and then open it up, maybe watch a trailer, probably not, read the text, and then look for the next thing, and then realize, oh, there's 25 things I want to watch, and I'm going to bed now because I've spent 2 hours doing nothing.
Yeah, I almost exclusively watch things that are expiring on streaming services.
Yeah,
it's like, and it's not even, part of it is like, well, I won't be able to watch these things soon. Like they'll go, quote unquote, go away. They won't. They'll be back in some other thing on often that exact same platform in 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
But it just like immediately helps me edit the options.
Yeah.
So it's just like, oh, these 15 to 20 movies on Criterion Channel that I've been wanting to see are expiring at the end of the month. I think this is where I'm focusing. And then obviously in October, I just do horror movies. So that's a bit easier. And then I try to spend the first week or so working through movies I bought in a physical way, but haven't actually watched yet, which is what all of this giant pile of stuff sitting behind me is. Stuff I own but have not watched yet.
Yeah. No, good for you. You when you were talking about being in another city and going through their stacks, that is my favorite thing in the world to do, just because, yeah, I mean, I haven't been in New York, God, since before the pandemic. It'll be 5 years next month that I haven't been to New York City, and it makes my heart cry when I think about it. Yeah. But the thing I'm going to do first is go to Academy Music and come out with an armload of stuff, because absolutely, that's my happy place. There's always one thing I didn't even know existed. I found a German Blu-ray of Michael Ritchie's Prime Cut 10 years ago.
Wow. Great.
And now, there's a Kino Lorber restoration and you can get it in 4K, but it's like, but I found it. Like it was a prize.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I was just watching, I hadn't seen it in a while. It became very clear to me quickly that it's one of those movies Jack Hill only directed some things for, but this exploitation movie, Mondo Keyhole, which I really love.
Oh yeah.
It's very, very clearly not directed by Jack Hill. I watched maybe 40 or 50 minutes of it. I don't think I've gotten to the parts that are identifiably Jack Hill. Okay. What I've seen so far is I'm like, there's no way this is Jack Hill. He has to have come in and done some other thing, or maybe directed some of the stuff towards the end. But I'm watching a DVD rip I made of the VHS years ago, and it's kind of nice. It's kind of nice.
Yeah. Well, when you mention Spider Baby in a new restoration, is that how we want it? Like years and years ago, I know Edgar Wright a tiny bit, and years and years ago, I gave him a couple of duplicate Shout Factory discs, Blu-rays that they'd sent me, and one of them was, I think it was Forbidden World, and it had a DVD, like a VHS quality version of it on the second disc, and he was so excited about it because this is the way he remembers it.
Yeah.
And that's it. Like if you clean something up too much, or even just adjust the brightness on it the way that James Cameron does with most of his movies, you change the texture, you reveal too much, or you leave the audience thinking that they're watching some sort of alternate version. And it's it's technically the way it looked to the filmmaker at the time when they first played with it, but it's not. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that. I mean, there's a version of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre where they cleaned it up to 4K and it is beautiful, but because that thing was shot on reversal, it never looks right. So it still feels like some sort of horrible artifact that was scrounged out of darkness.
Yeah, this is a bit of a jump from a reference point. On the Necromantic DVD.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about.
On the Necromantic Blu-ray, they have that scan of just the print, and that's the way to, again, that's the way to watch that movie. Some of these things you want to feel like they were processed in a bathtub.
Yeah.
And then last fall, was at a film festival in Leeds, and they were playing the very intentionally not restored, but new scan of Begotten, which also needs to feel like it was processed in a bathtub. And they were very much like, we did not do anything to restore this movie. We just scanned the print as it existed because part of the effect of this movie, that movie feels like a snuff movie from another planet, basically.
Yeah. It's out of time. So it's like making it too clean is the wrong instinct. I mean, I certainly am happy to have like good quality versions of these movies. And again, we're getting crazier and crazier movies as the depths continue to get plumbed, right? Like, I'm not mad that these things exist. I do think sometimes they look too clean. But I'm also very intentionally against something looking intentionally bad. Yeah.
Like, I do sort of hate when things are like should look clean but are overly processed in a to make them look gunky. I also respond negatively to as well. So there is a fine line. Fine line between sort of over preserving something and presenting it accurately.
Yeah, it's that digital film filter that people use where the sprocket marks and the scratches are in the same place every time.
It's terrible. Anybody. It's terrible. Those things are garbage.
I mean, there's a new special edition of Caligula, the Guccione brass thing, which includes the 3-hour cut, this new ultimate cut that they've just released, which is made entirely from alternate footage and alternate text. Like, there's not a single frame of the original in there, which is nuts.
I saw it. It's bonkers.
Yeah. But the disc comes with a second Blu-ray that has a 178:1 scan of a 35 millimeter print that was found in a Boston warehouse. It was the Massachusetts print. And it's got, it's got decay at the end of the reel and it's got green flashes. And it's just, that's how I want to think of this movie, as some sort of thing you stumbled into the wrong auditorium. This is burned into your brain.
Yeah, absolutely. I really liked watching that new Caligula, but I hate the opening credits are all digital and they're awful. Terrible.
The animated
Caligula. Yes, it's awful. It's awful.
Yeah.
Really put me off at the beginning of it.
I don't know.
30 minutes later, you're like, well, I'm watching Caligula, so I can't be that mad.
Yeah. It's fascinating. The commentary track on that, and sorry, as we turn this into a Caligula podcast,
sure.
Commentary track is
all
amazing.
Podcasts evolve into Caligula podcasts if they go on long enough.
Right now, I think they do. Yeah. No, the commentary track is the editor and the restorationist talking about how much they loved stuff and they had to include it. And it's like, that's not what restoration is. That's reconstruction. You're doing something. I mean, that's fascinating as an art object, but it's still Caligula.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is fascinating that they made this thing. I don't think I prefer it to the previously existing version of Caligula that I've seen.
Yeah, they're all so strange. And just to snap it back to Spider Baby, I don't know that I'd even believe you if you told me an alternate version of this film exists, right? Like, it feels like they used every frame. It feels like the whole thing is there.
Yeah. It's very purposeful. And again, it's also from that generation of people who came up in or ended up in the Roger Corman sort of sphere. It's very one-to-one. It's very much just like, in this person's coverage, just have them say their lines.
Yeah. There's no time, I do not doubt for a second that Manton Moreland was on set for that day, and that was it.
Sure. Yeah.
Maybe a day and a half.
Absolutely.
Maybe for some of the setups where he's riding the bike around. Maybe.
Yeah, that's got to be a day.
Yeah, and they shot it in 3 weeks, I think
Yeah,
is right, like 18 days.
I was just gonna guess 3 weeks.
Yeah, and the story of Cheney negotiating his salary is both really informative and really, really sad. Like famously, he was offered $2,500 for the whole thing, turned it down because that wasn't Lon Chaney Jr. money, which is fair. And then Hill offered the role to someone else, but they used the same agent as Cheney. So the agent let Cheney know, and Cheney's like, "I'll take $2,500."
Yeah.
And even if he thinks it's beneath him, he gives everything to it. Like I keep coming back to him because he's you know, the most famous person in Sid Haig arguably is the second most famous person in the picture, but there is something like it's not a Plan 9 from outer space thing for him. He's really in there.
Yeah, I mean it's certainly not phoned in, and I do think him being so well cast probably goes a long way too. You know, he's not being asked to stretch or really do anything that he's not comfortable with. Yeah, he is really good. And again, it's I also do think that like the vibe of a production, you know, will basically, you know, will rise up anything in it, right? So
yeah,
you also have to hope that like, you know, he got to set and it's these kids basically, right? Making this movie and probably hopefully had a good time, you know, and liked being there. And therefore, you know, happy actors are good actors. You know, they will do a better. I truly believe that if a happy crew and a happy cast will do better work.
I can see that.
And will give more for you than the other way around.
Yeah. Well, and based on that maxim, Sid Haig appears to have been delighted because he is beaming. Like I never recognize him. It always takes me about 20 minutes.
Him and that little Lord Fauntleroy outfit for dinner. It's incredible. I think he and Jack Hill are like college friends, right?
I mean, I know they knew each other before they started making movies. That would make sense. The college.
I think they're college friends because Sid Haig is in, forget what it's called, but there's like a Western short that Jack Hill made before this movie that Sid Haig, I think, stars in. I forget what it's called.
Oh, cool.
And then Haig, I believe, maybe not stars in, but has a big role in Pit Stop, which is the next like Jack Hill proper movie, which is also fantastic. Very different.
I've only seen it once,
but also
years
very
and years
good.
ago. Yeah, that was a VHS one for me. I haven't seen it since.
It's also really like grimy in a cool way. Very like he's very good with camera direction. Like his movies all feel very clean, you know?
Yeah.
And the coverage in them is never flashy, but the camera is also never in the wrong place, you know? It always feels like you're looking at exactly what you need to look at. But yeah, Pit Stop is like, yeah, you know, pretty greasy.
I mean, so much of his stuff, you know, the prison movies he made are really authentically sweaty, in the same way, and Coffee and Foxy Brown are practically cinema verite in terms of how they capture the worlds that they're shot in, and some of that, like the lighting package, I know can define a movie as much as the emulsion that you use and then the sets, but all of those things work together. Like he really was or is an intuitive filmmaker. As you said, the camera's always in the right place, but it's remarkable given how much genre work he did and how rarely he repeated himself, that he would have the right feel for everything. So that really does speak to an auteur theory for pulp in a way that a lot of people don't want to give those levels of filmmaking credit, right? Like it's easier if you imagine that they all just magically happened and all the good ones remained and all the bad ones were forgotten, because that's just how it works. But then you look at the names involved and you realize, no, these people were committed as much as, you know, Val Lewton in the B movie days of RKO produced genuine horror classics, which are much on my mind right now. Jack Hill knew exactly what he was doing, and Roger Corman could throw him in anything.
You know, I think there's probably a certain degree of like coming out of film school in the early 60s. There has a certain level of craftsmanship ingrained in you, because they have to think they're training people for TV directing jobs, which film schools basically are still doing. They're only training people to direct TV shows. Um, but it is that sort of like, yeah, it's just very, very simple, very direct approach to visual storytelling that is like, yeah, it's very confident.
Yeah, confidence, exactly it. And that makes the film feel less cheap and less slapdash,
Yeah.
right? Like it covers, as opposed to an Ed Wood thing where he just
Sure.
doesn't try
Sure.
to
Sure.
convince you. He may have been confident
Sure.
in his own skills, but it didn't translate to the
Sure.
frame.
Sure.
And Hill takes you by the hand and walks you into this bizarre house and leaves you there
Yeah.
for a good hour and a half. And
yeah,
then they blow it up.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
sad too. I mean, it is tragic. It is genuinely a tragic ending, as goofy as those last moments are.
Well, again, it's just like you are meant to sympathize with them. You sort of, you sort of want them to continue doing their thing.
Yeah.
It's sad that it's coming to an end. Also, the very, very, very end is also incredible with that little girl that walks up and looks directly into the camera, which is another thing that I love in movies.
Yeah. The question mark over the end, that sort of thing.
Yes, that's also great. Also great. More movies that start with people talking to you in a chair. More movies that end with somebody looking directly into the camera.
Yeah. And I'm thinking neither of those happens in The Becomers, so I'm slightly let down.
Yeah, no, sometimes you have to make notes. Though this is, I think, is the first one. Little Sister ends with the main character looking directly into the camera.
That's true.
This is the first movie I've made. Did we cut? Trying to remember if she does it, and if Anna Margaret does it in White Reindeer. She might not. I do love it when people look directly into the camera. It's happened several times. I've done it several times. I need to bring it back.
No, it's good to have a signature. And yeah, I mean that is the reason that we're talking. The Becomers is out again. It's in the world. It's on. It's a Blu-ray, not 4K, right? Is there a 4K yet?
No, it's just a normal old Blu-ray. But I think that's fine.
I don't want to spoil anything for anybody who hasn't seen it, and I'm always really conscious of that in a film like this, where the texture is the spoiler. Like you don't really want to talk about what makes the movie, but it is such a fascinating spin on what we would classify instinctively as a B movie, right? Like you're taking an alien invasion concept and just building out something so much more alive and rich. So yeah, the question is how do you know that you can do that and an audience will understand?
Well, the answer is you don't. The answer is you really, truly don't. I remember looking at the first assembly of this movie and showing it to a few trusted friends and then asking them to explain how the aliens work and then basically getting it right and being like, okay, huge relief. Huge relief. Because we wrote and shot this movie very quickly. I wrote it quickly, and then the cast and crew, made it very quickly. So a lot of that stuff was just left up to our own instincts to assume that when one actor leaves a scene in an outfit and another actor enters another scene in that same outfit, that will translate.
Yeah.
And that things like the glowing eyes and all this other stuff would help provide a path for people and be signifiers of things. But very, very honestly, you don't know until you put it up in front of people and then they say that it works. Because it's hard to know. It's hard to be surprised by something you know is coming.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to figure out something you have the answer to. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean. Like the challenge of getting something that works in your head onto a page and then onto of an image.
Sure.
It's so complicated, and the world is full of movies that don't quite get it. Miss the mark. And so when somebody pulls it off with the confidence, it's not like this is your first film, but still this is an order of magnitude harder than anything you've done before. Just to sell that concept to us instantly in a way that we understand, and then to make the movie that you made, which again I'm still protecting. because like
Sure,
my
sure, sure,
reflexes
sure,
as a
sure.
critic are like, no, don't go any further.
Sure.
But
Yeah, I mean, it's by design impossible to talk about in any way without spoiling something about it.
Yeah.
So I'm enjoying the exercise of trying to dance around what the movie is actually about. I mean, for me, it's not my first rodeo, and I've worked with the same cinematographer and the same composer for basically every movie. Same cinematographer for every movie, and then same composer for 4 out of 5 of them. And there is just a bit of like shorthand and stuff that goes a long way. And having, though I did not watch a lot to prepare for this movie, I would sort of discover that I was influenced by something in the making of it. You're like, oh, we lit this scene like a Fassbinder movie, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Uh, but it's for this movie, especially, it was really just instinctive. It was really just like, well, I wrote it. It seems like we should shoot it this way. Here are the locations that are sort of available to us. If this is the house, then I guess this happens here, and we shoot this over here, and we shoot this over here. Once you have a script and you know you're going to make a movie, everything sort of becomes a like problem to solve, for better or worse.
Yeah.
And you tend to just start with things on a macro level and then work. Okay, well, we're going to shoot this movie. Where are we going to shoot it? Great. Who are we going to put in front of camera? Okay, cool. And then you sort of start honing in, and that honing in goes up until the day you shoot it. And very often, especially on this movie, you're like, oh, well, I wanted 6 shots for this scene, and we only have time to get 2. And that's when your instincts really kick in. I'm an editor by trade, so that's how I make money and pay my rent,
right,
by editing features for other filmmakers and trailers and all other things. And those instincts I found probably more helpful on this movie than on any other movie. We did the thing in a couple scenes where I was like, well, let's only we're shooting this person's coverage. Let's just have them say their lines. Because the aliens in this movie often don't say too much, and the humans do quite a bit of talking. So I found myself pulling some of those tricks that you sort of would hear about from Roger Corman Productions.
Yeah.
On this one, which is apropos because the original intent of this was to do something in that style, was to be like, oh, I have to make a genre movie. I have to make it quickly and cheaply. So the producers of this movie gave me a budget and a schedule. And they're from Chicago, so they said, we have to shoot in Chicago, and you can only use local non-SAG Chicago actors as the cast. So knowing that, I sort of tackled it as if we were making a B science fiction movie. And that informed things like coverage and what the special effects looked and felt like, but also informed the mode of production in a way as well.
Yeah. And that in turn informs us. It tells us how to watch it.
Yeah, great, which is great. Which again is not something I would know.
No, let's hear for cinema literacy.
Sure.
Is there, I mean, we've already sort of talked around it, but is there anything in The Becomers or in other films that you've made that does feel specifically Jack Hillian? Like, did you lift anything from Spider Baby specifically, or is it more just the continuum of isolated houses and people in weird situations?
No, I mean, that's certainly, I did not watch Spider Baby in the lead up to this. I probably has been since I wrote this thing in 2017. Maybe I've watched it once or twice after. It's a movie I've seen so many times that it's impossible for me to remember necessarily when I watched it. But it had been a while since I sat down and watched it all the way through. Certainly not since certainly not in the like lead up to making The Becomers. But I do think what the echoes of it that I see, are this sort of, again, this very sort of like clean, direct approach to coverage is something I've always been very influenced by. And this almost, again, this sort of sense of like, you see a lot of it in like TV directing from this era. That just the camera feels like it's in the right place. There's not a lot of coverage. It's something that if you shot something like it now, people would be like, oh, it feels deliberate if you do it contemporaneously. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
And then also this just true sense of like, for Spider Baby specifically, and also for Female Trouble and the Faster Pussycat, even these movies I mentioned at the beginning, the sense that you are immediately identified with who is traditionally the villain. And not even traditionally the villain, but who is traditionally the outsider or the other. And you are asked to sympathize with them to the degree that, like, when inevitably they can't continue doing their thing that's causing them to be a menace to society at large, you, the audience, are sad because you were having such a good time watching them do the heinous, deplorable things that they've spent most of the movie doing, and you've come to fall in love with them as characters. I mean, that certainly is like very much at the forefront of The Becomers, maybe even more so than in other stuff. It's there in Little Sister too, but in Little Sister, there are no murders in Little Sister.
I mean, there's always time.
Sure.
Could be happening off camera.
Sure. In the sequel. Lots of murders.
My thanks to Zach Clark, whose new film The Becomers is freshly available on Blu-ray in a new special edition from Dark Star Pictures via Vinegar Syndrome. Thanks also to Kayla Heyer. She knows what she did. Zach's not on Instagram, but you can keep track of The Becomers by following Dark Star Pics, all one word, Pics, and you can find Spider Baby on Blu-ray and DVD from Arrow Video and streaming on the Criterion Channel, Hoopla, and Cult Pix in North America. It's also available in Canada on Shudder and in the US on Fandor, Arrow, and Prime Video, and you can rent it or buy it on various VOD services across North America. You can find me on Blue Sky at Norm Wilner, and you can find this podcast there at Semcast, SEMcast, and on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com. The first year of the show is still available for just $20 at payhip.com/Semcast. That's the first 52 episodes of Someone Else's Movie, 44 of which aren't currently available anywhere else. And check out my newsletter, Shiny Things, at shiny-things.ghost.io. I think you'll enjoy it. Our theme song is by The Last Year. If you like it or the show in general, please say so. Leave a review wherever you've been listening. Every little bit helps. It truly does. And check out the other shows on the Frequency Podcast Network while you're doing that. Stay safe, watch movies, wear a mask if you go out, get the new booster as soon as you can. I'll see you next week.
I'm registered dietitian Abby Sharp, and on my new podcast, Bite Back with Abby Sharp, I'll be dismantling the multi-billion-dollar diet industry that keeps us in a cycle of self-loathing and food fear. Join me every Tuesday for expert interviews, engaging conversations, and my signature science and sass to bust myths, correct misinformation, and help you break free from diet culture for good. Listen for free on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts.